major energy laws through the General Assembly. Now, a group of Madigan's peers will be charged with vetting his role in the scheme. Amanda Vinicky joins us now. Amanda, what's the latest here?
Brandis, it'll be up to a newly formed committee of 6 state representatives to investigate whether Madigan's done anything to warrant discipline, up to and including his removal from the House. Now, this process has been used before, but it's rare, twice since 2012. That year, when then Representative Derek Smith, a Democrat from Chicago, and then last November against then Democratic Representative Luis Arroyo, each time after those representatives had been arrested. That's why this time is different, says Representative Emmanuel Chris Welch. He is an attorney who was chosen by Madigan's deputy to chair the Special Investigative Committee.
In those situations, we actually had sitting representatives actually under indictment. There were actual federal charging documents accusing those representatives of specific wrongdoing. Here, we do not have Speaker Madigan indicted or charged with any crime.
Yes, Madigan has not been charged with anything, but he is referenced in court filings by his title as House Speaker. He's denied wrongdoing and continues to in a lengthy statement that we will have posted on our website. Today, again, he says, I have never made a legislative decision with improper motives, like exchanging his support for jobs. And he notes that those energy laws passed with bipartisan support. The law does not prohibit members of the General Assembly from making job recommendations, Madigan says, and he challenges House GOP leader Jim Durkin, who led the charge to create this committee, to disclose when he's recommended individuals for jobs.
It's important that the public knows that we, the members of the legislature, are not going to be intimidated, but we are going to find out as much as we can about what exactly happened. That's our job. That's our responsibility.
As House Speaker, Madigan really basically writes the rules that govern how the House conducts its business. And Durkin says Republicans are just availing themselves of those rules. Now, here's how it works. First, in order to form one of these special committees, 3 state representatives, in this case, Durkin and then 2 other Republicans, file a petition to commence disciplinary proceedings with an alleged charge. Then 3 members of each party are appointed to investigate, and their hearings are to be public. It takes a majority vote to move on to the next step of essentially bringing a charge against a member.
And in the past, because this has actually happened when someone's been charged in a federal indictment, the bipartisan work has been easy. I don't think our work is going to be easy here, but we're going to roll up our sleeves and see where this process takes us.
Welch promises repeatedly, in fact, to be fair and transparent. He says, like all others, Madigan is owed due process. But he says so far, Republicans need to specify a direct charge against Madigan.
They don't even specifically charge the Speaker with any wrongdoing in this complaint.
If this is going to be the beginning of the obfuscation by the Democrats and they need to defend Mike Madigan even before the testimony is heard, I think I know where it's going. But I would just counsel Representative Welch to read the petition and also read the deferred prosecution agreement.
Now, the deferred prosecution agreement is the court document in which ComEd admits to details about the bribery scheme. Republicans cite parts of that DPA in their petition to initiate the House's investigation. The petition also references a subpoena issued by the U.S. Attorney's Office seeking documents from Madigan. Durkin says that's just the sort of activity that calls for a legislative investigation.
I said earlier, we're the ones who must police ourselves. He doesn't do it through ethics reform. He won't do it. And maybe there's a reason why. But I'm not going to sit and let this go by without us asking questions that are important for ratepayers throughout the state of Illinois, and also members of the legislature who take an oath to do the right thing every year.
Madigan, in a statement, called the endeavor a political circus and a political stunt meant during an election season to distract from President Donald Trump. Asked about this, Governor J.B. Pritzker says he hopes it's not.
There are questions that need to be answered by the Speaker, and perhaps the creation of this legislative committee will actually get some of those answers. So I favor more information, more transparency.
Pritzker also called on Madigan and any of his allies to answer any questions posed by the committee. Now, there's no real timeline for this, though Welch says he does plan to move expeditiously. The law doesn't really set any rules. As Welch says, this is a political, not a legal process. Now, one more note. Leader Durkin says he has been in touch with the U.S. Attorney's Office and has been assured by prosecutors that this action is not going to interfere with any of their probes. Back to you, Brandis.
Amanda, thank you so much. And now to Carol Maureen and a new plan to help Chicago police. Carol.
Brandis, the Chicago Police Department is launching a new early intervention program developed by the University of Chicago Crime and Education Lab. The mayor's office says this. The goal of this system is to reduce the occurrence of adverse events that may harm officers, Chicagoans, or the public's trust in the Chicago Police Department. This amid longstanding tensions between the police and the community, and as CPD grapples with a suicide rate up to 60% higher than the national average.
To our men and women in uniform, please know that there is no shame in reaching out for help. If you see any signs that your colleagues are having trouble coping with stress, please check in on them and let them know you're there.
That, of course, was Police Superintendent David Brown. Joining us are Jamie Calvin, Executive Director of the Invisible Institute, which runs the Citizens Police Data Project. His reporting was instrumental in bringing attention to the 2014 police shooting of Laquan McDonald. And Maggie Goodrich, Project Director for the Early Intervention System developed at the University of Chicago Crime and Education Lab, and formerly of LAPD, where she took on a similar undertaking. Thank you both for being here. And Jamie, I'm going to start with you. In a nutshell, what's been the history of Chicago police with early intervention in the past?
It's a history of futility, having programs just for the purpose of saying you have a program. There was a noted program in the mid-90s, I think the name was Brainmaker, that, as I understand it, was really well designed and was so persistently resisted by the union that it was essentially scrapped. So there's a history of failing to identify patterns that it's within the power of the department to identify. I hope this is a new day, but that's definitely the history.
So Maggie, is this a new day? And if it is, what makes this system different than the past?
I think it is a new day. The system is different in that it was really built from the ground up with input from officers and supervisors within CPD, but also with input from experts in police accountability and reform, mental health experts, with the focus really being on, one, letting the data tell us what might be indicative of an officer needing help, rather than using intuition or some sort of negotiation to make that decision. And also, secondly, a focus on getting the right supports and services in place for officers so that CPD truly has something to offer if an officer does need support or help.
Can you help me with an example of when you say data, what are you looking for that's going to tell you we've got an officer who might need help?
So yes, it looks at complaints against officers, whether it's for on-duty or off-duty behavior. It looks at uses of force. And it also looks at what some might consider lower level or less serious potential misconduct or violations of policy and the like.
So Jamie, when you hear that, what are your thoughts on it?
So I have very little doubt that the Crime Lab has built a strong, robust system, a tool. I guess what I'm wondering about is almost everything I've heard and the rollout of this new system has emphasized officer wellness. Now, the well-being of officers is a critically important value. I don't want to be heard as minimizing this. But the reason that people are in the streets in this city and across the country, the reason we're under a consent decree, the reason we've spent the last 5 years with issues of policing at the center of our discourse in this city are patterns of abuse against citizens and patterns of impunity enabled by a kind of willed blindness within the department. So the question I would ask is, are the systems that are now in place going to be used to identify and investigate signs of abusive behavior? Or is it more the sort of soft interventions we've been hearing about in terms of officers who may be having mental health issues or morale issues?
So Maggie, in response to that, I'd add one other question on top of Jamie's. If these are questions of complaints, must the complaint have been sustained against the officer, or can it trigger this intervention before it's been proven to be true or false?
Yeah, the point of an early intervention system such as this is to really get at an issue well before we've had months go by on an investigation and a personnel complaint. So the data is being used early as the allegations come in. To Jamie's point, I completely agree that the impact on the community is a serious factor here, and not to be taken lightly. And that's where, I think it's important to note that this system, while yes, about mental health and supporting officers, it's also a system about accountability. It's about making sure that supervisors don't and can't turn a blind eye when they see something, going on that needs to be addressed. And that's also why a lot of the training actually around the system is very specifically focused on giving supervisors the skills they need to have meaningful conversations with an officer, often difficult conversations with an officer, to get at the heart of what's going on and be able to take action from there.
Jamie, that accountability is something that you have sought through all of your reporting and the creation of your own institute. What safeguards does accountability have to have?
I think there just has to be the most rigorous and ultimately transparent identification and then investigation of patterns. And, this is really not highly technical work. I mean, I appreciate the craftsmanship that's gone into the crime lab work, but a lot of this could be done with index cards. I mean, once you have the data, the patterns jump out at you. Officers with extraordinarily high numbers of complaints, officers who've been doing fine, and then there's a spike in complaints, groups of officers who have more complaints, each of them more complaints that could possibly be a statistical anomaly.
So Maggie, forgive me for interrupting Jamie,
Yeah.
as we kind of tick out of time, but Maggie, if a supervisor wants to look the other way, what's going to stop the supervisor from doing that?
So actually, CPD has also established an officer support system unit that oversees this entire solution, and actually is there to be checks and balances so that they work with the supervisors, help to hold the supervisors accountable, and also to make sure that the system is used and implemented consistently across the department, so we don't see different flavors of it depending on what district you're in.
Maggie Goodrich, Jamie Calvin, I'm sorry our time is so short. Thank you so much for being with us on Chicago Tonight.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Carol, thank you. On the eve of the Republican convention, President Trump heralded a decision by the Food and Drug Administration to issue emergency authorization for the use of convalescent plasma for coronavirus patients, calling it a, quote, very historic breakthrough. Since then, the FDA has had to walk back its claims as to the efficacy of the treatment. And just yesterday, more than 36 experts from the National Institutes of Health issued a statement saying there was simply not enough evidence yet to know if it works or not for COVID-19. It can all be confusing for members of the public hoping for treatments and vaccines. Joining us to share their insights are Dr. Vishnu Chundy, chairman of the Chicago Medical Society's COVID-19 Task Force and a senior partner for Metro Infectious Disease Consultants, and Dr. Robert Murphy, an infectious disease specialist and the executive director of the Institute for Global Health at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. So doctors, first let's hear what President Trump said late last month announcing the emergency authorized use from the FDA for convalescent plasma therapy.
The FDA has issued an emergency use authorization. This is a powerful therapy that transfuses very, very strong antibodies from the blood of recovered patients to help treat patients battling a current infection.
So, Dr. Murphy, let's start with you, please. First, what are your thoughts on the president's description just now?
Well, he's jumping the gun a little bit, but there's some truth to what he says. Convalescent plasma has antibodies in it that fight the virus. We know this. And in other diseases, it's been the same process has been used. There have been over 70,000 people have taken this therapy before it even had this EUA, this emergency use authorization. There has been no randomized clinical trials. So we're not sure if we're in the same place we were with hydroxychloroquine, where it was touted as being this great treatment, and then at the end of the day, it didn't work. But there's 144 clinical trials ongoing in the world today, looking at this, including 9 randomized clinical trials here in the United States, and we will get the final answer from that.
But it sounds like we don't have it today. Sorry, I just want to get Dr. Chundy in here as well, because I understand that you've been leading or helping to lead efforts to ensure that convalescent plasma is available in the Chicago area for COVID patients. Roughly how many people would you say have been treated with convalescent plasma therapy for COVID-19 in the Chicago area?
It has to be well over a couple of thousand. I mean, within our own group, when we go to 40 hospitals, and at the peak of the epidemic, we had close to 1,000 patients on service. It was insanity. And all we had was, at that time, people were throwing anything at the wall, hoping to save their patients that were dying. Dr. Murphy was there in the HIV epidemic, so that was a pandemic back then. I was an intern and a fellow, and now here I am with the second pandemic. And so we treated a lot of patients. We were looking for therapy. Convalescent plasma seemed to be a logical conclusion for infectious disease service. So Chicago Medical Society and our group, Metro Infectious Diseases, tried to get this out there. We actually reached out to the governor and other officials, trying to get them to sponsor trials in the Illinois area.
And Dr. Murphy, you were just referencing there are more than 100 trials around the world going on right now about this, so we don't really know. But what do we know today about the effectiveness of convalescent plasma therapy for COVID-19?
Well, the thing we know the most is that it's safe. So whatever we're doing, we're not hurting anybody. So that is actually paramount. And this is different from hydroxychloroquine, which actually caused some toxicity. But what we do know, in 35,000 people who took this, that the death rate was slightly lower in the group that took it if they started taking it within 3 days of being admitted to the hospital. And if it was over 4 days, the death rate was a little bit higher. This is where this 35% improvement that you've heard about. There's another study done up at Mayo Clinic where they looked at people who have high titers, in other words, stronger antibody response in the plasma versus lower titers. They didn't see much of a difference. However, when you dig down into their data, they showed that the patients who did not require a ventilator, only 11% of them died if they took it, versus 14% if they didn't. So that's the only data. These are not randomized clinical trials. We don't know what happens if you did nothing. You just treated the patient with something else.
Now, the president, though, the White House, they've called it a breakthrough treatment, but then we're hearing something a bit different from the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Chundy, what is the public to make of these sort of contradictory statements from federal public health agencies?
Well, as a treating physician, I just gave somebody today before I got on the air convalescent plasma. This was a very sick person who is about to get on a ventilator, and we've already given him the antiviral remdesivir. So I think this is up to clinicians who do this day in and day out. It is safe. It is safe. And if you have good titers, we're hoping it does well. We need randomized trials. And I think everybody who's in the clinical arena wants better information. The trials that were designed were for safety, and it showed it was safe. We need trials designed to show that it's effective. And then you can roll it out to larger trials. There are going to be monoclonal antibodies coming out soon. And so I think this is going to be a story of the past once we have enough monoclonal antibodies out there.
And obviously, everybody is hoping for a vaccine. Receiving word late this afternoon that the CDC is telling states to be prepared to deliver a vaccine to healthcare workers and other high-risk groups as early as October or November. So a lot more to come. We hope to have both of you back on the show to keep talking about this. My thanks to Dr. Robert Murphy and Dr. Vishnu Chundi. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been more than 30 years since the inception of the World Wide Web, and more than 4 in 10 adults with household incomes below $30,000 a year don't have traditional computer or broadband services. That's according to a Pew Research Center study from last year. This year, the pandemic has made internet access essential, and many of Chicago's Black and brown communities hit hardest by COVID-19 also lack internet access and devices. Joining us now to discuss the digital divide are Mila Kumpalova, a senior reporter for Chalkbeat Chicago, and Angela Seifer, executive director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. So Mila Kumpalova, let's start with you, please. You recently published a report in Chalkbeat that details inefficiencies in how Chicago provided devices and internet access to CPS students during COVID-19 compared to school districts in other parts of Illinois. Tell us what you found, please.
We decided to take a closer look at the device purchases that Chicago and other larger school districts in Illinois made after the pandemic closed schools abruptly last spring. And this was a project that we've been working on with the Better Government Association here in Chicago. So we basically made a database of all of the device purchases and spoke with experts and folks in those districts to get a better sense of how well districts have done. And we should say that clearly the circumstances were extremely challenging for the districts. They were not prepared for this, and they ran into significant issues with supply of devices at that point. We found that overall, districts, including Chicago, got fairly reasonable prices. We didn't find any price gouging or anyone taking advantage of those challenging circumstances. And the products overall made sense. In the case of Chicago, some of their orders for devices, for some reason, came in later than some other districts. And so there was a little bit more of a wait to get the devices into the hands of students.
And of course, a lot of school districts around the country at that time, of course, all of them were trying to make purchases of iPads and Chromebooks, leading to a delay, I'm sure. Angela Seifer, would you tell us, like, on a national scale, how deep is the digital divide? In what parts of the country are we seeing?
From U.S. Census data, we know that there's 20 million U.S. households in the U.S. that don't have access to the internet in their homes. So these are households, right? These aren't just individuals. And it's a very much an issue of availability of the internet in a rural area. But in an urban area, it's also a big point that it's expensive. The internet is expensive. And so right now we're seeing a lot of awareness around school kids not having access, but really lots of families don't have access. So I would encourage all the folks working on this really important issue to consider everyone in their community that needs service and needs help, not just our school kids.
Obviously, because there may be a household that doesn't have access. There may be 3 or 4 kids and a couple of working adults who need it. Mila Kumpalova, do you know roughly how many CPS students are facing obstacles to online learning, and what parts of the city are most in need?
So as Angela suggested, there are 2 pieces to that puzzle: the device piece, the computer piece, and then the internet connection piece. The district has estimated over time that there were about 100,000 students in the district lacking a device. And they have said that the internet connection issue affects, they believe, roughly the same number of students, even though we haven't seen a specific estimate on that front. The district has handed out at this point more than 100,000 devices, even though we have heard that some of the devices from the existing fleet of the district are in some cases getting old and not working as well for online learning. And it's a little harder to put a finger on where things stand with internet access.
Now, according to a 2019 Pew Research Center survey, 82% of whites reported owning a desktop or laptop, 58% of blacks, and 57% of Hispanic people. And we should also mention that with smartphone ownership, that's actually pretty much, that's fairly even across the board between whites, blacks, and Hispanics, about 8 in 10, or 80% of them owning a smartphone. Angela Seifer, what is digital literacy and why is it so important?
Digital literacy is being able to use digital tools, right? Just as we think of literacy as being able to read, digital is just you thinking about that in terms of your computer and the internet. So do you know how to use email? Do you know what a mouse is? How about the difference between a tablet and a laptop? Basic kinds of safety issues. And so one of the important parts that's necessary in making sure that everybody has access to the internet is that they also have access to digital literacy training. And Chicago is doing that in the plan. And I have to tell you, in lots of other places, folks are looking at Chicago because for one important reason is that Chicago is making sure that there's money for community-based organizations to support this effort to get folks connectivity and a device and the digital literacy. It's at the beginning stages, so we'll see how it goes. But the intent is spot on. Unfortunately, there's a lot of communities out there that aren't looking at that digital literacy piece and just having devices and the connectivity going out to families without that kind of tech support piece of it, which is really essential.
Okay. Mila Kumpalova and Angela Seifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight, United Airlines cuts 16,000 jobs because of a decline in travel. Why it'll be a challenge to staff up when air travel returns.
Once we said, let's go, that was the end of it.
Joe and Jill Biden head to Kenosha in the wake of the president's visit. Our Spotlight Politics team takes a closer look. Plus, a lifelong dancer is working to keep his Indonesian culture alive through Balinese dancing. But first, some more of today's top stories. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden says he's visiting Kenosha tomorrow after widespread urging by party leaders.
We got to heal. We got to put things together, bring people together. And so my purpose in going will be to do just that, to be a positive influence.
The visit comes on the heels of President Trump's visit to Kenosha yesterday after the mayor and Wisconsin's governor asked him not to. Trump says he went to thank law enforcement who kept the city from being, quote, burned to the ground. We have more on Biden and Trump's visits to Wisconsin coming up in Spotlight Politics. A fixture of Chicago TV has died.
Come on in to Bob Rohrman's Schaumburg Honda Automobiles, where the deals are sizzling. At the corner of
Bob Rohrman's commercials were a staple of Chicagoland television for decades, an enthusiastic pitchman for his huge chain of auto dealerships. The commercials were known not just for Rohrman's antics, but for the ubiquitous slogan,
"There's only one Bob Rohrman."
A native of Lafayette, Indiana, his company says Rohrman died of complications of age last night. Bob Rohrman was 87 years old. New coronavirus mitigation efforts go into effect today in the downstate Metro East region. The area, which sits east of St. Louis, now has additional restrictions on activities like indoor dining and drinking, as do Will and Kankakee counties. Governor J.B. Pritzker, along with a group of doctors, are urging Illinoisans to stay safe over Labor Day weekend and says that until there is an effective vaccine, changing the way people gather is an ongoing challenge.
Sharing a meal, sharing a drink are ways of networking, connecting, sharing attention and affection. But as we're designing and redesigning many of our activities and our young people are learning how to learn virtually, We need to find alternative ways to share and connect and communicate with others.
And the Illinois Department of Public Health today reports 2,100 new cases of coronavirus, bringing the state's total to more than 238,000 cases. Another 27 people have died for a total of more than 8,000 deaths. The preliminary 7-day positivity rate is 4.5%. Chicago-based United Airlines says it's cutting 16,000 jobs. It's the latest hit to the airline and the aviation industry that have already experienced a lot of turbulence because of the pandemic. Joining us to tell us more about the cuts is Crane Chicago business senior reporter John Pletz. John, welcome back to Chicago tonight. So is it clear, absolutely, is it clear how many employees will be impacted in the Chicago area?
Just over 2,000, about 2,300 employees. That's roughly 16% of their workforce here. They got about 15,000 employees.
So, of course, it's already been reported, just how badly the airline industry has been impacted because of the pandemic. Put this in perspective for us. Would you, is this as bad as it sounds? How does it compare to other, national disasters like 9/11?
Well, it's every bit as bad as it sounds, although it's not quite as bad as they had feared. United, by the time you get done with the furloughs as well as the voluntary exits they've already had, you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 26% of their workforce. They were fearing just a month or so ago that it was likely to be much closer to 30%. But it's a lot, a quarter of their workforce. The only time that was worse was the early 2000s when you had sort of the double whammy of both 9/11, which obviously really hurt the airline industry, followed by a recession, which ultimately, United ended up in bankruptcy. So you put those two things together and it was about 29% of their workforce. So it's about as bad as you can imagine.
You also write that staffing cutbacks in aviation are particularly complicated. How so?
Well, you're particularly with the pilots, it's really complicated because they have to remain certified on their aircraft. And so once you take pilots off the line, the training cost to bring them back is significant. So if you think that, United is roughly cutting 25% of its staff, flying right now is down about 70%. Depending on who's doing the forecasting, there's hope that maybe you get to 50, 60% down by the end of the year. So what that tells you is United's really trying to plan not just for now. What they're really trying to plan for is a year from now, summer of 2021, the peak of, flying season. And so that's where it gets tricky. How many pilots are you going to need? How many planes are you going to need? And you can't, it's not like other industries where you can very quickly lay people off or furlough them and bring them right back. And that's why it's tricky in the airline industry.
Are we seeing this magnitude of cuts at other airlines as well?
Yes, American, which is the second largest airline here in Chicago at O'Hare, they cut a similar amount. They're actually thinking that their total staffing is maybe down more than 35% from where they started the year by the time they're all done. But they said maybe a week or so ago they were going to cut about 19,000 jobs.
Okay. My thanks to John Pletz at Cranes. Thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Dueling messages in neighboring Kenosha with President Trump there yesterday and Joe Biden visiting tomorrow. Our Spotlight Politics team also takes a look at Republican state lawmakers demanding an investigation of Speaker Michael Madigan's involvement in the ComEd bribery scandal. Here with all of that and more are Amanda Vinicky, Carol Marine, and Heather Sharon. Welcome back, colleagues. So let's start with the president. He continued to tout his law and order message during his trip to Kenosha. Take a look.
These are not acts of peaceful protest, but really domestic terror. My administration coordinated with the state and local authorities to very, very swiftly deploy the National Guard, surge federal law enforcement to Kenosha and stop the violence.
So, Heather, what did the president accomplish yesterday?
Well, I think that's very much an open question. What he was trying to accomplish was to convince voters that he was somehow not responsible for the violence under his watch, but that somehow Joe Biden was, and that if people voted to elect Joe Biden in November, that sort of violence would come to their hometowns. Now, I think that's a little bit of a hard argument to make, and we've started to see some polling that as of yet, it hasn't changed sort of the status of the election.
And it sounds like a continuation of the argument, Heather, that they were making last week during the RNC when we were all talking about this. Amanda, the president, though, did not meet with Jacob Blake's family. Why not? And is there a strategy here to his messaging by not using words like racism or even saying Jacob Blake's name?
He didn't meet with them. Well, he says it's because that Blake's family wanted to have an attorney present, and he thought that to be wrong. That said, there are members of Blake's family, and of course, there are many relatives, so that's where there can be different messages here. But they say they didn't want to meet with him, and in fact, there are some Blake relatives who called the president a racist. So yes, I think there is a strategy in not saying Blake's name and instead focusing on law enforcement. Then those are the sound bites that we all have and use that spreads Trump's message. But what this is also telling us by both Trump's visit and then Biden's visit tomorrow, I believe that this is the first time that a Democratic nominee has gone to Wisconsin since 2012. And that's pretty incredible when you recognize that this is a battleground state. So regardless of what is happening in Kenosha, that of course is a headline. It is drawing significance there. But both of these nominees are well served to get out their message in that state because it is going to be an important one in determining who wins.
And as we've said, as you just mentioned, Amanda, the Bidens are visiting Kenosha tomorrow, Thursday. Here's what Joe Biden said about the president's trip.
The incumbent president is incapable of telling us the truth, incapable of facing the facts, and incapable of healing. He doesn't want to shed light. He wants to generate heat. And he's stoking violence in our cities.
Carol, what do you expect from that trip? And do you expect that the Bidens will be visiting with Jacob Blake's family, unlike the president?
There's every reason to believe that they will meet with the Blake family, Brandis. But there are a couple of things here. Joe Biden's got to get out more. Joe Biden hasn't left the East Coast very much or Zoom. Donald Trump has been out more. And so Joe Biden has to cast himself as a person who has all the vigor and the ability to go meet the voters, to see the Blakes, and also not to take for granted his poll numbers, which are better than Donald Trump's in Wisconsin and some other places. But no Democratic strategist is going to tell you that this is the most comfortable place to be this close to the election. So he has a lot of work to do to declare himself really the national leader, not Donald Trump, and to also make the case that looting and rioting are not the same thing as demonstrating.
Now, Illinois' black state officials are calling on legislators to prioritize the needs of the black community during the fall legislative session. Take a look.
We have waited for far too long. It is long overdue. And we're calling all debts. The black agenda is due today.
Amanda, you covered this week. What are the black caucuses? What are their priorities?
There really isn't anything concrete at this point. Rather, as we've reported, they're going to hold hearings and then come out with a specific plan. But it is everything from recruiting and encouraging black male teachers in schools to healthcare, and then also contracting and hiring of more black-owned firms and workers, particularly on construction jobs. So it is a big platform, and of course, going to be a very large part of that is both violence reduction and police accountability and reform. That was the first one, and that could be where things do get complicated. Black legislators say they are determined to get this passed, and they called on their peers, their white colleagues, to join with them. But let's be clear, this will be something that is going to be a difficult ask for certain legislators, particularly because when you make changes like this, it is going to oftentimes involve money, and Illinois doesn't have a lot of it. So that means it will be coming from certain districts and priorities and needs and moving to those deemed priorities by the Black Caucus.
Right. This is also a relatively short fall legislative session. Heather, will this be at the top of all the lawmakers' agendas? Is the time right now?
Well, everybody's going to have their own agenda like they do every session. I think the question is what the price tag is on these items, and are there sort of areas where everybody can come together to compromise? Now, we've seen Attorney General Kwame Rule really push for licensing of police officers. That's something that got a good deal of support several months ago. So I would imagine that an issue like that, where there's already broad consensus, could be something that everybody's agreeing on. But again, the big question is going to be, what does the pandemic look like in the fall, and what does the state's budget and revenue picture look like?
So GOP lawmakers, they've demanded an investigative committee to look into the ComEd bribery scandal. Here's what Speaker Mike Madigan, who's implicated but not charged, said, quote, "I have never made a legislative decision with improper motives. The notion that the passage of two consequential pieces of energy legislation was tied to the hiring or retention of a few individuals is seriously mistaken." Carol, what's the GOP's hope with this committee?
Well, there's an election coming, Brandis, and that's first and foremost on their mind. And the fact that Madigan, even though he is in this vat of hot water, or so it seems, still is in a position to potentially add a couple more seats in the House by some people's lights. So the Republicans are doing what they need to do, and that is to try to impeach Madigan. Now remember, Bruce Rauner tried to make Mike Madigan an issue for his entire term. Jim Durkin, the Republican leader, has tried to do it for years and years. And excuse me, they're still playing by Madigan's rules. They have 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats to launch this beginning of an impeachment. That pretty much takes it to a draw if the Democrats stick together.
Amanda, if the Democrats have a supermajority and are still sympathetic, or maybe sympathetic to Madigan, will this committee have any teeth?
Yeah, I mean, it's notable that the Democrats who were appointed to serve on this, none of them are those who have called on Madigan to resign from his position as House Speaker or as Democratic Party of Illinois chairman. So presumably, these are Democrats who will play by his rules. Again, spoke with Representative Welch, who says that he is going to be fair, that Madigan is owed due process. But as Carol noted, this is likely to come to a draw. What is going to be interesting to really keep an eye on and watch, though, is what is aired, if anything, during these hearings. Will it lead to any sort of additional attention on particularly Republicans or Democrats, nominees who are running in some of the swing districts, that voters that are Democrats that don't want voters to tie them with Madigan? And again, will there be any additional dirty laundry aired of Madigan during these proceedings?
So back to the city, Mayor Lori Lightfoot announced Chicago's stark fiscal future this week. Here's a bit of that.
Our projected gap for 2021 is estimated to be $1.2 billion. Let me say that again, $1.2 billion.
Heather, is the mayor hoping for federal funding as a bailout?
Yes, is the simple answer. Otherwise, there's really no easy answer to fill that hole, which is really magnitudes larger than last year's budget deficit, which was the largest in Chicago's history. So it's really impossible for me to overstate the perilous financial position the city finds itself in. It also comes at a time when the mayor is potentially going to have to ask aldermen to take some very tough votes, and she has spent most of her time in office trying to reduce their power, or when she's not doing that, she's been criticizing them in sometimes the most personal and direct terms. So now she's going to have to turn around and say, oh, but could you take this really tough vote for me? Thanks very much. That's going to be a very, very tough ask. It's going to be a very intense couple of months, and we will have to see how it all plays out.
Of course. So, Carol, you spoke with her on Monday. What else could be on the horizon to plug this hole? Tax hikes?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Property taxes. But remember that more than 90% of the property tax is dedicated to pensions. So it would have to be a whopping property tax increase. She's talked about computer licensing taxes. There's the TIF surpluses that she can declare and throw over into this, but it is a situation, to call it grave is to vastly understate it. She's going to have to look for money everywhere, cut some executive salaries. She's going to have to scale back on workforce. There are going to be layoffs. There's a lot in this.
Amanda, the city saved $1 million by changing Alderman Ed Burke's Finance Committee structure. He's no longer the chair of that committee, of course, but that's a drop in the bucket when you're talking about $1.2 billion. Give us a sense of the size of this.
Heather, this article pointed that out and looked through the city's finances and accountability, and I'm no mathematician, but that's like 0.1%. I mean, not even a percentage point. So no, it is just as you characterize it, a drop in the bucket. I nonetheless think that it is worthy of attention because for taxpayers, particularly when they are being asked to deep reach into their pockets, even businesses, particularly at a time when people are fearful. We've heard about United layoffs, when people are scared for their jobs, individuals can't eat and are increasingly relying on food pantries. $1 million is a lot of money. So no, not hugely consequential when it comes to the overall budget, but I think that journalists, alder people, politicians, period, are well served to not ignore that sort of spending and savings.
Every million counts. Heather, speaking of Alderman Ed Burke, he's scheduled to go on trial, or he was scheduled to go on trial in 2021. That might not happen now. We mentioned it earlier in the broadcast. Explain, please.
Well, it's really a combination of two things. The pandemic, like everything else, has made it impossible for large jury trials to take place at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse downtown. So there's that complication. But even under normal circumstances, if we can all cast our memory back to remember what that would look like, this is a really difficult trial. There is a massive amount of evidence. There were thousands of phone calls that were taped. There is a witness who we believe is Alderman Danny Solis, who is prepared to testify against Ed Burke in return for leniency on his own corruption charges. So this is really just a behemoth undertaking. And we heard the judge say this morning that he was just not sure when everybody would be ready to go to court, especially because Alderman Burke's attorneys are challenging those wiretap warrants, it's challenging everything. So it was hoped that this trial would start in mid-2021. I would be surprised if it starts before 2022. And let's not forget, Alderman Burke is 76 years old and is up potentially for re-election again in 2023.
This could go on for a while. Chicago tops 500 homicides in 2020, surpassing the total for all of 2019. Carol, top cop David Brown was touting the city's progress, actually, saying that overall crime is down by comparison. Is there a disconnect here?
Well, numbers can do all sorts of things depending on how you go at them. Month to month, there has been a drop in violence, but year to year, we're 50% up. And when it comes to officers shot, there were 15 shot in 2019, 15 in 2018. We've had 51 shot so far. So it really depends on which side of the looking glass you're peering in. But I would still argue that there's a profound violence problem in Chicago, and it does not look like it has radically decreased, if decreased at all.
Heather, we've got about 20 seconds left. The superintendent has said that the new CPD structure is helping. Is that helping? What's helping?
Well, he has created 2 violence suppression teams that they are basically able to deploy wherever sort of violence pops up in the city. That has made the department, David Brown says, more flexible and more, efficient. However, it's really yet to be shown whether that is going to pay off long term. Like Carol said,
Right.
there are statistics, lies, and damn statistics. So
All right.
that's really how it works.
We'll have to leave it there. My thanks to our Spotlight Politics team, Amanda Venicky, Carol Marine, and Heather Sharon. Up next, the art of Balinese dancing, but first, a look at the weather. A lifelong dancer is working to keep his family's Indonesian culture alive through Balinese dancing. Arts correspondent Angel Edo reports on how this dance style is bringing new communities together and educating the next generation.
For years, Pak Nura traveled the world with a professional dance troupe from Indonesia before landing in Chicago.
We have about 13,000 islands in Indonesia. He's learned a lot more of the different sections of the country and has compiled so many dances and knows so many dances, and that has worked with him throughout the years. It's his trade, it's his craft.
Now, Pak's daughter, Chica, tells me he grew up in Bali, where he learned a number of Balinese dances. He's taken everything he learned from that point on to teach free classes and perform with the Indonesian Dance of Illinois group, where Chica and her older sister also perform.
This performance is called Tari Topeng Tua, and literally translated, it's a mass dance of an old person.
Culture very important for the kid, or very why, because learn culture, they will talk inside, will be soft, art, and then maybe good for each other.
It is very important to keep the culture alive. My dad has been making some videos, trying to maybe incorporate everything he knows into knowledge for everybody else.
For Pak, it's important that everyone utilize art for self-expression, especially now with limited outlets due to the pandemic.
We do music, we do dancing, and there's other forms of art, but everybody has it within themselves.
He fosters a sense of community around him where everyone just has a sense of comfort, even though it can be scary to learn new music.
Now, my introduction to Pak's culture didn't end with the gamelan. I also learned a traditional Balinese dance.
Up, down, left, right, up.
And then performed with Chica as Pak and Augustin played the gamelan. It only took one afternoon for me to understand the importance of Pak's community.
Giving other people the opportunity to enjoy something new in a place where it's open to learn it. He still wants to teach, and he's such an entertainer that it won't stop.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Edo.
And that's our show for this Wednesday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm named by elite lawyers as the top aviation firm in the country in 2020.